This is Hannibal from HannibalTV.com, and I'm going to do my weekly review of the Wrestling Observer newsletter. I don't go through the whole thing. I just go through the points that I personally find interesting. So to start off, the big news is that on Sunday, Shad Gaspard, who is 39 years old, went to Venice Beach in Marina del Rey, California, with his wife, Selena, and 10-year-old son. Gaspard, who was 6'6", is best known for his Crime Time tag team in WWE. I have a full shoot interview actually on this channel with his partner, JTG. He was only doing rare indie appearances and mostly doing acting in recent years. He had hoped to get into AEW, where he wanted to feud with Private Party, as he discussed in his interview with me back in November. I've done several interviews with him on this channel. However, for whatever reason, AEW didn't appear to be interested. Shad and his son were body surfing about 50 yards from shore when a dangerous tide came in, according to reports. The lifeguards saw Shad and his son. Well, having trouble staying afloat himself, Shad was waving to the lifeguards to take his son and save his son. The lifeguard took the son back to land. And while the lifeguard was taking the son back, a wave estimated at 5 to 6 feet overtook Shad. Biggest Richard Cranium just tipped me $2 and says, "Shad, we all miss you, dude. Thanks for the tip." Nicholas Rogue tipped me $2 and said, "I miss Shad Gaspard." Thank you, both of you, for the tips. Shad never came back up after the wave engulfed him. Divers and rescue boats, as well as a helicopter, were immediately called and searched basically until the sun went down Sunday night and all day Monday. Wednesday, early in the morning, 2 people noticed a body washed up on shore about 1 mile from where Gaspard had gone missing. When police arrived, they immediately recognized it as Gaspard. He was still wearing the same swimsuit that he went missing in. So, really great guy. I met him 3 different times. He was very nice to me all 3 times. Came off as very genuine. This was terrible. I was really upset over this. God bless his family. And to get into other WWE news, as far as SummerSlam being in Boston, it doesn't look very promising. Vince McMahon really wants SummerSlam to take place in front of fans this year, and it doesn't look like the mayor of Boston wants crowds. He said there's going to be no fans in Fenway Park in July or August. The mayor of Boston says they won't even be near a situation where there will be herd immunity at that time, and there certainly won't be a vaccine. So it's unlikely that an event with fans would take place in Boston for SummerSlam. There might be other states that would allow it, possibly a state like Oklahoma, from what I've read. So we'll see, as some fans will be better than no fans. So Boston is looking unlikely. Ric Flair re-signed with WWE. He had denied that he was re-signing with the company up until a few days ago, but it was confirmed on May 20th that he re-signed. He even tweeted out the page of his contract that he signed. Drew Gulak, for those that follow him, he had a match on SmackDown last week, but that was his last match with the company under his old contract. He has not re-signed. He had hired attorney Barry Bloom to represent him, but there's no new deal. This is a bad time to negotiate deals with WWE. They just fired a large amount of people, and there's a pandemic and lockdown going on. not a good time to get a raise. There's not really any other place to go where, unless you're a big star, you could get a contract. I'm not sure if this Gulak guy is exactly a household name. I actually hadn't heard of him at all until these reports came out this week that he is no longer under contract. Kane was on Fox News this week discussing on the negative effect that the COVID-19 lockdown is having on the economy. It is having a horribly negative effect on the economy, and the way they're going about reopening stuff, I really don't get. For instance, here in Canada, where I am in Ontario, they still don't have cancer doctors working a full-time schedule. Most family doctors aren't working a full-time schedule, but yet vasectomy doctors are back full-time. Makes sense of that. Vasectomy is like a fairly minor operation, but you can get that. But having cancer removed, you can't get that done right now. I don't understand it or agree with it. Michael Mansouri, who was the former vice president of global television productions for WWE, has left the company. Michelle. It's either Michael or Michelle. Either way, they left the company. I think it was Michael. They left in April, but it's just coming out now. Mansouri directed a number of episodes of Raw and SmackDown if Kevin Dunn didn't make it. So possible replacement for Kevin Dunn is gone. There was an ad during Raw this past week for The Rock's Titan Games show, which is going to be going head-to-head with Raw starting next week. So that will likely affect WWE's ratings, which have already been falling. Nikki Bella recently said on a main event radio show that both WWE and John Cena had editorial rights in the recent autobiography that was recently released about her. She also stated on another show called Better Together that the reason why she broke up with John Cena was, quote, overall, we had such an incredible relationship. It was just two people that wanted two different lives. We were trying so hard to make it one. And it was like, even in the end, he was willing to give me kids, but I could just tell it was not what he wanted. Biggest Richard Cranium just tipped me another $2 and says, top channel, bro. Just like, bro, the effing best, bro. Obviously, Biggest Richard doing his Vince Russo impression there. Martha Hart released a couple statements this year. One was about why she has a strained relationship with Bret Hart now, which could explain why Bret Hart was not in the Owen Hart Dark Side of the Ring documentary this week. Martha was quoted as saying, Bret was supportive through the lawsuit, but there were a few things that were a problem with Bret. First of all, when we were going through the lawsuit, he was hoping that I would help him get his wrestling footage because at the time he had no relationship with WWE, and he was hoping somehow if there was ever a settlement, we could work in the ownership of his WWE footage into the settlement. That didn't happen. Bret was very upset that he didn't get his footage. It prompted him to befriend Vince again so he could have access to his footage. That was the first fracture in the relationship. She also said Bret got very nasty with her when she refused to give her blessing for Owen going into the WWE Hall of Fame. That's not really surprising, knowing everything I've heard about Bret's personality. Martha also said, in related to Owen Hart going into the Hall of Fame, quote, their Hall of Fame, they don't even have a Hall of Fame. It doesn't exist. It's nothing. It's a fake entity. There is nothing real or tangible about it. It's just an event they have to make money. They put it on TV and they have a celebration, and it's just so ridiculous. I would never entertain putting Owen in the Hall of Fame It's garbage. Finally, Martha also responded to some negative comments WWE attorney Jerry McDivitt put out about her this week. She said Jerry McDivitt's comments are absurd, reckless, and pathetic. I am not surprised that the WWE would trot out Mr. McDivitt to do damage control. After all, the events surrounding Owen's death and the aftermath that followed are extremely disturbing and do not reflect well on the company. I agree with her on that, particularly the people that are going to make excuses for WWE are always going to have excuses. But the fact that they continued the show after he fell from the roof to his death and there was blood on the canvas, it was a crime scene. It should have been investigated immediately, but they continued the show and the police didn't even stop the show. I think that's highly disrespectful to a dead talent that had worked for that company for over a decade, because he did start with WWE in 1988. This incident happened in 1999. The crowd would not have rioted, as WWE has said a few times. Nobody would have cared. They would have understood. Yes, you would have had to issue refunds, but that's a small thing in the grand scheme of things. Michael Duval just tipped me $6.99 Canadian and asked me what my opinion on CCW issues with their female wrestlers are. Greasy stuff. Well, Lufisto is involved with that. Lufisto is the Great North Wrestling Women's Champion of Canada right now. From what I understand about that, now I don't really follow CCW. I'm not a fan of CCW personally, so I haven't really been following this closely. I did see the clip that Lufisto put out there. I didn't really want to give any of CCW publicity, but since Michael tipped me $6.99, I'll answer this. From what I understand, CCW recorded their matches for their own release, but I guess what's happened is they sold their footage to another distribution company, and that company released a bunch of female wrestling DVDs from CZW with very sexual names and so forth, basically really focusing on the fact that these were sexual, very sexy female wrestlers in them, and emphasizing sexual aspects of the female wrestlers on the DVD covers and names of the DVDs. And Lufisto and some other wrestlers who appear on these DVDs have an issue with it. And I guess CZW's response is they sold the footage. There was no clause in the contract of selling the footage of how these companies could present the girls, so it's out of their hands. So it's a sticky situation for sure. So as I said, I don't know the details of that, but I am friends with Lufisto and I'm on her side. I'll stand by her. And I think it's an unfortunate situation for sure. Damien D. Meza says, thanks for promoting Canadian Strong Style. Well, Great North Wrestling is the strongest style of wrestling in Canada for sure. True Sinister tipped me $2 and said, did I see and like Beyond the Mat? I did, yeah, because that was the closest thing to behind the scenes around the time that was released. I forget when exactly, the late 90s, but I remember being a kid at that time and being fascinated about the behind the scenes stuff that was released in that. Back to the news. Thanks for the tips again, Damien and True Sinister. The U.S. and Canada borders are going to be closed for another month. So that's going to affect travel for some WWE wrestlers like the Singh brothers and Bobby Lashley. Brock Lesnar, the reason I think he's still been able to cross during the lockdown is he has a residence in Canada, in Saskatchewan, but he is an American citizen. So I don't think they could deny an actual U.S. citizen for coming into the U.S. because he is a citizen of the country. And I don't think they can deny him coming back into Canada because he has a residence in Canada. We all know he has a big, huge farm in Saskatchewan. So I think that's the reason why Lesnar has been able to cross here and there. Also, big companies obviously can pull strings. In ratings news, AEW did a 0.26 rating this week, and NXT did an abysmal 0.13 rating. So the score now is AEW 27, NXT 5 with one draw. AEW is kicking their ass. Total Bellas once again even had a higher rating than NXT. Total Bellas did a 0.2. Raw this week was the second lowest rated Raw in history with Kevin Owens' return. Did a 0.51. I think the lowest rated segment on the show was the Drew McIntyre segment, from what I understand. The record low rating happened just a few weeks ago on May the 4th. That was a 0.46. So they did get a 0.51 this week. Record low was 0.46. We'll see when they beat that record low. SmackDown on May the 15th, last Friday night, did a 0.5 rating. The final episode of Dark Side of the Ring featuring Owen Hart that I was just talking about with those statements from Martha Hart was the largest viewed show in the history of Vice, getting a 0.18 rating and 349,000 viewers. Damien Demiza just tipped me $4.99. What are my thoughts on AEW not recognizing champions from other promotions, such as Kenny Omega as AAA champion? Well, I have no issue with them doing that. Why would AEW use their TV time, which is precious, to promote other promotions that might not always have AEW's best interests at heart? So I agree that AEW shouldn't necessarily recognize any of their wrestlers that might be champions in other promotions. I don't know much about that. This is actually the first I heard about it, Damien, but I agree with them. Same thing with this Marty Squirrel guy who said he would like to see a cross promotion between AEW and Ring of Honor. Why would you do that? Ring of Honor, nobody watches it. Nobody cares about it these days. Why would AEW want to give their precious TV time to a company that nobody cares about anymore? Doesn't make sense. True Sinister just hit me $5. Do I think Jim Cornette went too far with the Vince Russo thing? Thanks for the $5 tip, True Sinister. I don't know how much of their angle is a work and a shoot, to be honest with you. I don't really follow it. I do watch Jim Cornette clips here and there and Vince Russo clips here and there. A lot of people think that I have an issue with Jim Cornette because I've had probably 4 interviews with Vince Russo now and 0 with Jim Cornette. The only reason for that is Jim Cornette has refused to do an interview with me. I've asked him 3 times. He said no 3 times. Vince Russo has said yes every time. That's the reason I have Vince Russo on there. I'm neutral towards their feud. I don't know if it's a work or a shoot. You never know in pro wrestling. They certainly use the feud as content on their platform, so you never know. Back to the news in relation to Vince McMahon. It appears that he might be attempting to buy the intellectual property of the XFL from bankruptcy court and then resurrect the XFL. This is speculation right now. The idea is that Vince McMahon would buy the assets of the league, the intellectual property, and some contracts he would want to keep for the bankruptcy sale price. which would allow him to still have ownership of the league again without having to pay the approximately $50 million in debt that he still owes. That was part of the cost of launching the league before he put it out of business. The league apparently, and this is news, the league was owned 80% by Vince and 20% by WWE. So the WWE actually owned 20% of the XFL. This came out in the bankruptcy filings, and this called into questions statements that have been made in XFL conference calls where Vince had claimed WWE had no involvement with the XFL. Well, it came out they actually owned part of the XFL, so it wasn't really a solo venture as Vince had claimed. There's still a lawsuit going on with Oliver Luck, who the XFL owes over $20 million to. It is believed that Vince may have ruined his name with Luck and many of the coaches that had money owed to them in relation to the XFL bankruptcy. So if they want to start the league up again in the future, there might be some issues related to hard feelings due to that. However, there's so many players that want to play football after college that can't make it to the CFL or NFL. They wouldn't have issues getting players. At 75 years old, with WWE's popularity in a decline, I really don't see what benefit it would be to try and resurrect the XFL again. I don't think there's much demand for it, as I'll take a sip of my coffee here. CMLL sent out a message saying it's likely they're not going to run again in Mexico City until September. In news related to Van Hammer, Michael Hildreth, who is a fuck up to say the least. He's now 60. He had a WCW contract for a long time, even though he was the drizzling shits. But he did have a great body. He plea bargained his driving under the influence and causing property damage, or he plea bargained his recent case of hitting a kid. He hit a 5-year-old boy riding a bicycle, knocked the boy on top of his car hood, but the boy was not killed and not seriously injured. This happened January 26. He was able to plea bargain down to a driving under the influence, causing property damage charge. I'm guessing that's the damage to the kid's bike. He was sentenced to 1 year probation, 1 year suspension of his driver license, and also must have an interlock device placed in his car for a year. He must attend classes. I can tell you right now, if that had happened in Canada, Van Hammer would have a much, much more serious charge against him. That's really a slap on the wrist, but hopefully it wakes him up. If you listen to my Mark Marrow shoot interview, Van Hammer was having issues way back in the early 90s, even at the time in the early 90s when Mark Marrow was roommates with Van Hammer. So let's hope he cleans himself up. He's lucky he didn't kill that kid, and he's lucky he doesn't live in Canada, because Canada would have given him more than 1 year's probation, I'll tell you that. Malafay tipped me $2. He says, pro wrestling is dead, never coming back. I do think it could come back under the right circumstances, but it would be a tough job to do. Really tough job to do, but it's definitely not healthy right now. Even though WWE has huge TV revenue deals coming in, I wouldn't say it's healthy right now. Mathis Bofetti just tipped me $5 Canadian. Thank you very much, Mathis, and Malafay again. Mathis says, thank you for my content during this lockdown. You really enjoyed my Tom Pritchard interview. You're welcome. My next interview is coming up is going to be with Dan Severin and Ricky Morton. In UFC news, UFC had an event on the 16th from Jacksonville, Florida, which I saw the main event of this online. It's Alistair Overeem, who has a first-round knockout victory over Brock Lesnar, headlined the event with a second-round TKO victory over Walt Harris. This was Walt Harris's first fight since the murder of his stepdaughter back in November. Horrible, horrible situation. They were supposed to fight originally in December, but that was canceled due to that situation. So the fight was stopped at 3 minutes in the second round. Overeem got paid $400,000 for winning the fight. Harris got paid $75,000 for losing the fight. Now, they did recently bring Cain Velasquez into WWE. Cain Velasquez had a first-round TKO over Lesnar. I wonder if WWE is going to offer Overeem huge payoff to come in and lose to Lesnar. By the way, Cain Velasquez, I've read some reports since his release. Supposedly, Cain Velasquez's WWE contract was a $5 million a year contract. So you could understand why they probably released Velasquez from his contract. That's a huge money deal for somebody who wasn't fully trained yet. And I am a Velasquez fan. I hope that he continues on in wrestling. I would love to have him in Great North Wrestling. I think him against the Blood Hunter anywhere would be a great fight, even if it was in PCW Ultra in California, which is a little closer to Velasquez. But I don't think either PCW or Great North Wrestling could afford him at $5 million a year. But maybe if he were to make a deal, it could be a good guy to see. The UFC Overeem show from Jacksonville had 1.198 million viewers on ESPN. So that just goes to show you, even though wrestling is declining, it still has more viewers for Raw and SmackDown than UFC gets on ESPN. Kevin Randleman, former UFC heavyweight champion, was announced on that show that he's going to be inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. Congratulations to him. If you watch my full career interview with Mark Coleman on here, you can hear him talking about Randleman, who Coleman helped train. There is no UFC show this week. The next event is supposed to be on May the 30th from Las Vegas at the Apex Arena, where UFC headquarters is located. By the way, there is a video on here from a few years ago of Forrest Griffin, another UFC Hall of Famer, giving me the tour of the UFC Performance Center, which I really enjoyed. I suggest people look that up. The Nevada State Athletic Commission will meet on May 27th regarding allowing events with no fans in Nevada. If it is approved, it looks like UFC will pretty much tape all their future US shows from the Apex Performance Center. Otherwise, Arizona is going to let sporting events with no fans happen, so they will move to Arizona. The May 30th main event for the UFC is scheduled to be Tyrone Woodley versus Gilbert Burns. In the pay-per-view to follow, it's likely going to be June the 6th, headlined by Amanda Nunes versus Felicia Spencer for the women's featherweight title. UFC announcer Joe Rogan will likely be there on June the 6th for that fight. And his Joe Rogan Experience podcast is moving to Spotify in September for a reported $100 million deal. I don't know much about Spotify, but I am a fan of his podcast. Spotify seems really complicated. So hopefully with him moving there, they'll make it less complicated. I don't know if they have videos on there or not. There's been talk over the past week that John Jones could fight Francis Ngannou in heavyweight That would be a big money fight, but both Jones and Ngannou would want to be paid good money for that fight. So we don't know if Dana White's gonna want to pay them the money they would want for that fight, but there's a lot of fan interest in that fight. And finally, Khabib's father, who's 57 years old, awoke from his coma after having heart surgery last week, but then he unfortunately took a turn for the worst, and he's been placed for a second time on a medically induced coma. The last word Dave Meltzer has heard is that Khabib's father is unable to speak. Of course, it was his father that trained him in Sambo. I'll do a few questions now. That's the end of my Wrestling Observer review. Thank you for listening. Michael B. tipped me $2. How are my dealings with Randy Hales? Michael B., thanks for the tip. My only dealings with Randy was the one interview I did with him last year online. He asked to do the interview with me. So I did the interview with him. That's the only dealings I've had with him. Marvelous MYC tipped me $75. Marvelous MYC, you have the record for my highest tip of the week so far. Thank you very much for the $75. He says he's showing some love from Taiwan. Bought my nephew tickets to my last event in Brockville. Even with the Haku issue, my nephew still had a blast. Thank you very much. Yes, it's very unfortunate. Haku had a work visa issue, or a green card issue, actually. They would not let him come to that event in Brockville. He did make it up to us. He came to Great North Wrestling twice since then. He got his green card issue sorted out. I'm glad you had fun at that event, Marvelous MYC. And I thank you very much for the $75 tip. I can't do any better than $75 today. So Marvelous. I'm going to end this Wrestling Observer review with that. Have a great weekend, everybody.